Hi everyone, welcome. What you see here is my tracking spreadsheet. It's the spreadsheet that I manage information in about all of my active worm bins, as well as all my historical completed worm bins. So any bin that kind of comes to an end is shown here with a little red line at the end of the bar, showing what day it was harvested and the worms were hauled out of there. And then, similarly, the green indicates the start of a new bin. And today I wanted to talk a little bit about a few bins that we've really not talked about in quite some time, and it's the ones that you see over here. The annotation that you see does not make reference to a harvest of castings or the haul out of worms. All you see listed here is the reference to how the bin was emptied out in the garden. And that recurs a few times. You see it here, 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 and here. As a matter of fact, it even shows up here in one of my European nightcrawler systems. But I want to talk about the red wiggler systems. It's these orange bars that you see here that refer to the red wiggler systems. And you know what happened? All my red wigglers died. Every single one of them. All my bins came to the same end where the material got overly damp. I believe that the environment became anaerobic. The absence of oxygen basically caused the poor worms to suffocate and die. And then mites came in and overran the systems and just became a big mess. So it seemed like my only recourse was to empty the bins out in the garden. And that's in fact what I did with the first system. In fact, I did show it on a video back on the 18th of April, showing me going out there and dumping the stuff out into the garden. But with these other three, where it also says the same thing, emptied the bin in the garden, I didn't really do exactly what it says right there. I did take the bin outside into the garden, but I never emptied the bins. All three of those bins sat out in the garden for quite a while, up until just a few days ago, not too long ago, maybe a couple weeks ago. I really felt like I needed some of these containers to do some new things. So I went ahead and I consolidated all of that material that was sitting there in those three old red wiggler systems, and I placed them into this last one here, the one that ended 58 days ago on the 10th of May. And it almost filled up the container all the way to the top of the rim. But, over those past 58 days, that material has been just sitting out there. Well, even going back further, right? Over the past 65 days, more than 2 months now. Some of that material's been out there for more than 2 months. It was always sheltered from the rain, always set up in a way that it was permitted to, kind of dry. That was ultimately what the major problem was in all of these, was that they all got just overly wet. And then it was maybe about a week ago, I went in there out of curiosity to see what was going on with that material. So I went in there and I tilled up the material just to see what was going on in there. And to my surprise, I found worms in there, and quite a number of them, all cruising around, and they were little small ones. I don't think it was any of the worms that were originally in there. I don't think any survived, but I believe it was worms that were actually born in those containers from the cocoons that were still in that material. And what I did about a week ago, or maybe more now, and none of that's recorded, I went in there and I set up sort of a fresh batch of bedding. I threw some leaves in there. I believe it was basically nothing more than leaves, and tried to give the worms an environment that they can sort of move into. And I dampened it all, and I covered it with plastic so that the moisture would remain in there. And I'm not checked in on it at all. So I'm just curious to see what's happening in that system. And since we've never even talked about it here, I thought I'd give a little bit of a backstory. But I was about to head out into the garden with the camera to see what's going on out there. I'm going to slip on a glove and take a peek in that bin to see what's happening, and then decide what to do with it as far as the next steps are concerned. But at this point, if there are worms in there, and I know there are, that seems to be like my last chance at really sort of reviving that population of red wigglers that used to live in my wormery by, bringing those worms back in and maybe starting a new bin someday with them. So let's head out there now and see how things stand. So it's out here on the edge of my garden where I have this old table, and right here is the container that I'm referring to. So as I mentioned earlier, it's covered with plastic to try to keep the moisture in there, and all the rest of that is that piled up old casting material that at one point I believe had gone anaerobic. And even over here you could see some other bins. These were the bins that I worked on yesterday. These actually have all the contents of my outdoor worm bin in them at this point now. Similarly, sitting underneath this tabletop to keep them protected from the rain. So we're gonna get this up onto the top of the table, take a peek inside, see how it's coming along. So now to cover up, all I did was I took this old calendar and I slipped it inside of an old Ziploc, create a little bit of a vapor barrier to try to keep moisture down on this end of the bin. These little blocks of wood were just meant to try to keep the airflow from coming and going on that side of the bin. And I guess that last piece on top was just meant to be a little bit of a paperweight. And this stuff has once again, over the past week or so, continued to dry out here on the surface. I did till it all up last time I was in here. And the material is definitely getting drier and drier as time goes on. You do almost have to go to the very bottom to get to any material that has any moisture content remaining. And that's where I had found the worms the last time I came in here. And my hope is that perhaps because of the ongoing drying of the material, the worms are going to just kind of, you know, do what they naturally do, is seek out a more comfortable place to be where there's more moisture. And yeah, I gotta say, this stuff has dried out big time since the last time I was in here, and I got a feeling it's because of the tilling that I did. By kind of disturbing it all and breaking it all up a little bit into little chunks, I think I permitted a lot of airflow to pass through the material, and similarly moisture that's, you know, contained within material that's down low was able to sort of seep its way out of the container and evaporate. So I'm not really so far encountering any worms, and hopefully that's not a bad sign. Hopefully that's actually a good sign to indicate to us that the worms have, you know, probably sensed the drying of the material happening, and maybe they've gone searching for a better place to be, which I had set up for them on this side of the bin. So let's push things over a little bit over here and see what we see. So this is something you see me do sometimes in my worm bins down in my wormery, as I try to set up a little dividing line to indicate to me where one portion of the bin ends and then the other portion of the bin begins. Not to say that it would have been very difficult to tell where the old castings end and where the new feeding zone begins, but we've actually now bumped into a couple worms, oops, who might just be in transit on their way over to the section of the bin where the moisture has been allowed to remain within the material and recirculate with the plastic covering. So I'm not sure how much more we're gonna see if we keep probing around in here. My hope is that what we're gonna end up with is a bunch of worms over on the side of the bin where there is fresh bedding, fresh moisture, and, you know, even you could see I did some weeding. I knocked off some plants that were growing a little bit out of control on the edge of the property and threw the cuttings in here, this cover, and then I just used a bunch of dry leaves from my leaf collection as the basis for the bedding, but I had soaked it all quite thoroughly before using it. So I thought I saw another worm over here. So I've actually encountered, I believe, 4 worms at this point over here on the edge, and I believe they all came from the very lowest reaches of the bin, where there's still a little bit of moisture remaining within the material, but certainly not a lot. I would think as this stuff continues to dry, and it probably will do so as a result of me having tilled it all up like this, it'll eventually become so inhospitable that the worms will definitely need to seek out a better place to be. So I didn't really expect for this to come to an end today. I'm certainly prepared to just allow this to continue as is and give the worms a little more additional time to evacuate the old castings. And you can tell this stuff is pretty nasty. It's really hard, clumpy stuff, all stuck together as it dries. And you know, back when it was still kind of the end for the bins that they used to be in, the material had all been so damp that you couldn't really even, you know, worms couldn't even move around. So worms were really just kind of trapped in the stuff and, you know, perishing by not being able to move around. So I'm not sure how much more to expect. I mean, there could be still some life on the bottom layers down low. And I mean, even here and there, I'm still seeing a cocoon or two. I suppose it would make good sense to move that over as well if I see any. But I would think if it's already been a couple months now, sitting around like this, most of the cocoons that were in this stuff, if the cocoon wasn't like trapped within a chunk of material like this, then I would think the baby worms would have all had an opportunity to sort of squirm away and maybe dive down deep to seek out some moisture. And I'm sure there's plenty of food scraps in here too for them to take advantage of. But I think at this point we're gonna try to get a sense of how this whole attempt at recovering some of the worms in here is coming along. So why don't we probe around in here a little bit and see what we can see. So yeah, you can see all I did was I chopped down some weeds and pretty much threw them in here, sticks and all. So why don't we just set these aside briefly. The whole idea of that stuff was meant to sort of act as an additional moisture barrier to keep the dampness down within this material here. So I had soaked all of these leaves substantially in the hopes that the stuff would be kind of a nice place for the worms to make their way over into. But I don't really see any yet. I'm a little surprised. I actually thought that they'd actually be in here, at least some of them. And you can see I did set up a cardboard partition with a whole bunch of holes in it. So the holes in the partition were meant to permit the worms to be able to pass through it pretty easily. So I've got to admit, I'm pretty surprised not to see any worms in here. But it is kind of damp, and it's just a whole bunch of material that the worms should theoretically really like. A bunch of leaves, right? So I'm just wondering if maybe just a little additional time is needed to let the worms make their way over here eventually. Even wondering if maybe the removal of this piece of cardboard might be all that's needed to let the worms actually make their way over here and kind of find it. So you can see one worm was actually right on the cardboard at the very edge, possibly coming over for the moisture that had seeped into the cardboard. I'm wondering if down here too maybe we might encounter a couple more worms. If we do, we'll just help them over into the area where we'd like for them to try to congregate. I thought I saw one down here. So, you know, I kind of had high hopes when I did go probing through this material and I spotted a number of worms hanging out. I did start to think that maybe this was a chance at actually recovering a portion of my red wiggler population that died out in this material all those weeks ago. And it does seem like, you know, we've got a few here and there. I'm sure since I'm not being overly thorough and looking through this stuff, we're not seeing them all. I'm sure there's a good number more. And they're probably down really low within the material where it's still kind of damp. So perhaps all I really need to do over here is give it a little bit more time. And you know what? Maybe I'll actually exclude this piece of cardboard at this point, because maybe they're bumping into that and not being able to make their way over into the leaves, into the fresh bedding that I set up for them. So I will exclude this piece of cardboard. And I'm even thinking of upping the ante over here to see if I can even better stimulate the worm movement in this material. So I've got some coffee, I've even got a chunk of melon that I could throw in here. So I thought about maybe putting a couple pieces of food in here, maybe the worms would sense that and try coming over for it. And then maybe we'll actually start getting a little bit of a turnout over here. And who knows, maybe after only a week of this being here, maybe that's just insufficient time to expect for any of the worms to have made their way over yet. But I think there's no harm in, you know, setting up a little bit of food over here so that maybe they'll come over for it, and then maybe we'll actually see something going on in here. And then we'll cover it back up and let it continue as is. So let me go inside really quick and grab a couple chunks of food to set this up with, and then we'll continue. So I'm not going to go overboard. Well, as you saw, there's only a few worms in here. If the whole idea is to, you know, sort of set that out there as something for them to sense and maybe come over for, I'm hoping one piece is sufficient. And whatever. I mean, in addition to the bedding, if they do come over, I thought maybe a little bit of coffee mixed in could also serve as sort of a nitrogen-rich food supplement to go with what's in there now, because all that bedding is basically almost like a carbon-only setup. So, nothing too fancy here. I guess we'll just sort of submerge this piece of melon, sort of smack in the middle. Maybe face the meaty portion of it in the direction of the finished compost, or the compost. I don't know if it ever really got to the finished stage. And we'll just leave it sort of buried a little bit. And then what else do we have here? You know, we've got the coffee. I guess the coffee, maybe the coffee will be really the major food supply if the worms do start congregating over here and they do need something to eat other than just the carbon rich bedding out here. So I'm thinking, I've got this piece of paper. I really want this stuff over here to remain nice and damp and cozy for them. So I'm thinking I'm going to use the paper coffee filter. I'm going to use this cardboard, which had previously been sort of a dividing wall, but I'm going to also use that as sort of a vapor barrier to keep the moisture down within the bin. And we'll return these leaves to, you know, be right on top as well. But let's sort of build this back up and level things off, sort of the way we found them when we got here. And we'll just let it all continue. I'm starting to feel like by the next time I come back in here, if I wait another week or so, even the stuff on the very bottom of this container is probably going to be fairly dry. And whatever worms are still hiding down in the lower reaches of this material, they'll they'll definitely be required to find something else, you know. They're going to need to find some place to go where the material's, you know, damp. And hopefully we'll end up rounding them up over on this edge of the bin. Is this even worth my effort? Is it just a futile attempt, which is going to just end up in disappointment? I don't know. It doesn't matter to me. I'm always up for experimenting and trying new things. So we're going to set this right back up just the way we found it, or similar to the way we found it, minus the dividing wall, adding a little bit of extra food, which will maybe draw in some worms, but I believe this is more or less the way I had it going, and we're just going to let it continue. So we'll see what happens. Alright everyone, that's it for today's video. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Please let me know what you think. If you enjoyed it, please give me a thumbs up. That's always really appreciated. Please also consider subscribing to the channel too if you haven't done so already. That's really appreciated as well. Alright everyone, thanks for watching. Have a great day. Bye now.